in hashish. I'm told that the first hashish arrived in Zonyana in the hands of a policeman. Interesting. And that the policeman got two of the villagers to take some hash then down to the city, but it was a trap. And one of them realized it, so in the end it didn't work, and the village knew what was going on. Nonetheless, they rapidly realized that selling marijuana would actually be very profitable, and it grows very well in that particular climate. And from there they went to selling hard drugs, selling weapons, including, yes, Kalashnikovs, AK-74s, 47s, I mean, and also a few cases, sadly, they were involved in the skin trade as well. But that was a relatively minor part of it. Now, those who were involved in those activities were, and insofar as they still are, a very small minority in the village. In 2007, suddenly 500 armed, masked, heavily armed, masked policemen arrive in the village and put the village essentially under siege. The villagers, who normally would have expected the police to arrive in maybe with 3 or 4 officers who would go with the village president to arrest the culprits and expect the culprits to be very proud of being arrested because that proved their masculinity, right? They were against the state, against the law, so they were real men and would swagger through the village under guard, and there would be no problem about their trying to escape. This was a big mistake. The problem is that the police now are not trained in the sociology of rural life. They don't understand that arriving in this way was a provocation that actually led to fatal consequences. However, it is also true that although the villagers returned fire, I mean, apparently there was quite a confrontation, most of the villagers then retreated. They didn't want much trouble. And it was only a small group of maybe 15 men who continued to resist, and one of them apparently killed the policeman. This, of course, led to a vindictive response by the police, and a perfectly understandable one in some ways. Don't forget also that many police are themselves from Crete, and they understand very well the revenge code, so that it would actuate a lot of their responses, even if that's not part of the official story. Be that as it may, the village was on lockdown for about 2 months, and it had a very radical effect on what people thought being a man was about. First of all, it reinforced some of the old habits because the villagers, the village men, felt humiliated. Policemen would ask them to lie down on the ground, order them to lie on the ground, or even to dance while they searched their vehicles for drugs, and humiliated them. And these are men who are not going to tolerate any kind of humiliation, but they often did not respond to the provocation. Occasionally, individual police officers behaved well. In one case, a man I know very well was watering his vegetables, and they really were vegetables. There was no hash. But he had a reel of plastic hose in front of his house. His garden was right behind the house, and he was getting ready to water his vegetables, his garden, when a couple of policemen arrived and slashed the hose on the grounds, presumably they thought it was going to be used to irrigate hash. He, instead of trying to fight them, went straight to the commander and said, "This is what's happened." And the commander said, "I will make sure that by nightfall your hose has been restored, and I will also have the police fix it so that you can do your irrigation." And in fact was as good as his word. So it wasn't an absolutely black and white picture of good and evil, but it is certainly clear that many of the policemen took the opportunity, perhaps out of a feeling of revenge, to humiliate all of the Zonyani, and especially the men. They would also humiliate the women. They didn't bother them sexually, because that would have certainly started a revolution. But what they did very often was to go into the kitchen and say, "There's a knife here that exceeds the length that's permitted." Now, you know, if a woman has a knife there for cutting up vegetables, it's not going to be a very dangerous one. But the police were determined to break the spirit of the Zonyani, and what they actually succeeded in doing was uniting the village even more. Nonetheless, the gang that was involved in the actual killing does remain a bit isolated. In fact, the cafeteria which they frequent is right on the outskirts of the villages and the only one that faces away from the village. I find that very significant, as also the fact that they're only usually all there after about 11 at night, so in the dark of night. I was wondering how I was ever going to talk to these guys, because I wanted to know the story from them, and I didn't think they would talk to me. But one evening I was returning from the theater, which I'll show you in a moment, which is outside the village. It was pitch black. I was actually rather terrified because there were lots of dogs barking at me as I walked down the road. I couldn't see them. But then I got to this cafeteria, and suddenly a voice said, "Mikhaili, come here! Elope!" And I go in there, and there they all are. And they wanted to talk. For them, I think it was almost a form of confession. So I got to know the self-professed leader of the gang. And here we find a very interesting detail that I think will show you that modernization doesn't necessarily mean that these kinds of attitudes will change. In fact, they can be reinforced. It turned out, we had a long conversation about what happened. He said, well, you know, I'm the only one who has the full transcript of the trial. And I have it now. I have almost all 1,700 plus pages of it. It's better reading than any novel I've ever seen, I can assure you. But he said, you know, I had a pretty serious charge against me, so I was supposed to be the ringleader, so I'm the only one who has the whole document. And they put me away for several years. And when I was in jail, along with my friends from the village, we discovered that there were other people there who were the high-ranking managers of Siemens Greece, Siemens Elas, who had been put in jail for corruption. I always tell that story. I think last year I talked about how the Germans were accusing the Greeks of corruption while they were busily bribing them. But the Greeks actually took it very seriously and sent a lot of those responsible to jail. And so he said, you know, these guys didn't know how to act. They were people like you, he said, talking to me, right? They were no use in a prison context. They didn't know how to defend themselves or anything. So we appointed ourselves their bodyguards while we were in with them, and nobody dared touch them. So they continued to use their masculinity as a critique of the state, in a way, but also as an expression of their strong feelings of honor. So the men, now this man actually is very much against that group. But, you know, life in villages is very tied up, so that one of his sons is actually the partner of the leader of the gang. So it's quite complicated. But the performance of masculinity is still very present. The huge mustaches, the proud bearing, the ability to tell a good story, often about your exploits. And he was actually the man who told me the story when he was younger that allowed me to open up the vocabulary. Just a few portraits now. Father and son. Son considerably fatter than the father. You can see the relationship, but the son, of course, has a truck, so he's able to go up and down the mountain comfortably. A lot of joking in the coffee houses. I thought a sequence might be interesting. And this man came out of jail because he had killed the brother, he had killed the murderer of his brother. It is still an obligation in these communities, and a socially strongly imposed obligation, that if a male relative of yours is killed, or a female relative but in the male line, you are responsible for dealing with it. And if it's a son, a brother, or a father in particular, but always in the male line. So he got a 24-year jail sentence, which then became 12 years because he was in a rural jail, and he ran the coffee house in the jail. So when he came out, poor man, he came out, his wife had been running the jail, the coffee house, sorry, the whole time, and died there soon thereafter. So he's now about 90 years old and very lonely. But he is still the object of deep hatred from the other village. So a few years ago, they drove a truck into Zonyana, past this man's coffee shop, and through the glass window there, tried to shoot him. Fortunately, they missed. I have been in that coffee house many times, and it sometimes makes me feel a little uneasy. They now say that the problem is beginning to dissipate. He's too old to be a fair game for revenge killing. This was the man who actually originally, sadly, he passed away last year, but he was the man who originally took us up to the village. I should tell you how I got there the first time, because it's not really a common thing for someone, even an anthropologist, to end up in these places. I didn't even know of the existence of Zonyana. I had identified another village where I wanted to do what in retrospect would have been a rather boring study of marriage and kinship, and I think the village itself was fairly boring, but I went to the wrong bus stop. And with my wife, and a man was standing there said, well, wait, where do you want to go? And I told him the name of the village. He said, it doesn't go from here. Why do you want to go there? And I explained. He said, you don't want to go there. You want to go to somewhere in Milopotamos. I have a friend who works on the buses. Yanni, that was Yanni. Come over here. And Yanni took us up to the village. And it was a marvelous first introduction. The only problem, again, was the dialect. I remember the next day we came walking back through the village. And every cafeteria was cold. It was November, very cold and wet. Every cafeteria, somebody called to us, "Elote na pirofite." I said, "Na pirofume." I thought he was saying, "You coming to be paid?" What does that? Anyone understand? There are some Cretans here, I know. Na pirofite, na zestafite, from pir, to get warmed up. Anyway, so we got warmed up with more than the wood stoves. We got warmed up with a fair amount of tikuya. And so by the time we got to the middle of the village, I was fairly drunk and very happy to agree with one of the villagers that we would come back and rent his house for 4 months. And that's how it all began. Nowadays, the village has all sorts of additional accoutrements because one of the village presidents, actually the son of the man who had been president for 28 years, decided that the best way to get beyond the damage done to the village's reputation by those incidents of 2007 was development. And one of the things they did was to build a theater just beyond the village, so there it is. And this, of course, is the self-awareness. These are children, young boys, playing at being shepherds and speaking in verses written by a village teacher in some sort of version of the local dialect. Back in that cafeteria, that actually was the place where I think they shot through the window. Again, just a few scenes of everyday life. This man on the right is the last one in the village to wear the sariki. Nobody else wears it anymore, the turban. And this man actually was one of the gang, and he was the first one to talk to me. I think, he obviously is quite pleased to be identified as such. A lot of things go on in the village that are on the borderline of legality. For example, running a little restaurant without a permit. Playing cards is okay. Playing cards for money is not. I know at least one person in this audience will recognize the gentleman here. I'm not going to say if there's any association between the two photographs. If any of you know the person in question, you can draw your own conclusions. Another illegal activity, if the knife is longer than about 5 inches. More signs shot through. And my favorite was the stop sign. Right. Stop! Bang, bang, bang. Now this document, which you can read some of, those of you who know Greek, I'm just going to read out some little bits of it so you can, in English, so you can see what's going on. This is the indictment, right, from the legal documentation. So number 16, for the practice of continuing to hold and use, I can't really see it very well from here, the use of Indian cannabis, in other words, hash, right? They are asking for the accused to be declared guilty. For the attempt to criminal escape, somebody tried to run away, and then it goes on like this. And a lot of the charges are, of course, katochi opru, the possession of firearms, and use of the firearms against the police. But there's another side to the village, because today the things that used to be considered effeminate, especially anything to do with farming, good shepherds do not touch farming. Good shepherds only work with animals. Now, people who, for example, here are trying to do organic farming will get credit for being innovative, and men who previously would never touch a salad in public, maybe in private, but never in public, are now boasting of the special vegetables they've grown and how delicious they are and how wonderful. We'll see some of that in a moment. This is what becomes the meat, of course. Now, this is a kaniski. In the old days, the practice called kaniski was to bring a basket with a quarter of an animal, a loaf of bread, some macaroni or some spaghetti, to the wedding of anyone you related to. Now there's been, I can only call it kaniski inflation, because instead of bringing a quarter of an animal, you have to bring a whole animal, and that doesn't give you much chance to bring any bread or anything else, but the bread is all commercially produced now anyway. I like the t-shirt that says, "What's your identity?" But the practice of meat consumption has not slowed down at all, quite the opposite. And as they say, have you been at a wedding? Then you've eaten stolen meat. Sort of makes the point, doesn't it? I mean, how many animals would you have to slaughter for this? Sheep's head's a great delicacy. And notice, the women are still making the salads. The difference is that the men cultivate the vegetables and eat them. That's a big difference, because in the old days, the biggest insult, so if you, for example, discovered that a farmer had stolen a sheep from you, farmers were not allowed to under the code because they didn't have flock animals, and it's a very strict code. So if you discovered that a farmer had stolen from you, you would send him, in one case I know about, he was sent a package of vegetables. It's pretty insulting. That's women's food. By the way, it doesn't only happen in Greece. I mean, I remember going to a New Year's binge in the community I studied in Thailand, in Bangkok, and the men called me over and they said, "Here, we've got some liquor, I want you to try it." So they gave me this rather strange looking white stuff. It wasn't translucent at all, but it tasted quite good. I said, "Yeah, okay, fine." And then they gave me one that was mauve in color, and I was a bit nervous about that, and rightly so. It tasted awful. Then they said, "Which one did you like?" I said, "The white one was much better." And they all started cheering because the mauve one was a women's drink by definition. So it's not just in Crete. But anyway, here we are. And meat consumption has not, as I say, ceased. Grab for it. This is 2 days, I think, after a wedding, when there was still a lot of meat in circulation because you saw how many animals they were slaughtering. So what happens is that the cafeteria, suddenly somebody, there was a card game and somebody won, and there we are. There's meat for treats. And at a baptism, look at that, right? Very scientific. But there's the difference. What you would have seen in the old days was maybe a plate with a few limp slices of tomato and cucumber. But now we have real salad, and they're very proud of the salad. Because now you can be a man by boasting that you really understand quality of food, even if it's salad. And even in the, remember the heavily mustachioed man I showed you before? In his household, he likes his meat, but he doesn't eat very much of it anymore. And notice, all vegetarian, except for that plate at the back, but the stuff on the right is actually kolokithokeftedes, so it's also a vegetarian dish. Now, as I say, one of the results of modernization, globalization, call it what you will, is that Cretans have become more aware of the commercial value and also more aware of the importance to them of showing themselves to be authentic in some way. And so they created a dance troupe, and this was the office of the dance troupe. It was actually very moving. In 2013, I was given an honorary doctorate by the University of Crete, and the gang, the whole group of, these are school children, they came down and performed at the ceremony. It was a way of saying, Zonyana is with you at any time. And the old president, whose name was Lazos, for 28 years he was president, had a compound of houses, which he bequeathed to his children. One of them became a doctor, went to Germany, where she married another doctor, a German, and she runs this hotel in honor of her father, which has a sort of museum in the front, actually. And this hotel is quite remarkable. She called it 5-star, which may be a little bit of an exaggeration. Very comfortable in the basement. So I went from getting terribly fat on all that fatty meat in my 20s and 30s to actually losing probably several kilos, because I worked out every morning in the basement of the hotel, and then I would go out and do my field work, and it was quite schizophrenic, but it also told me something about the real changes in the community. That now, for example, it's okay to use modern conveniences, and the villagers were delighted that I was staying at the hotel. They thought this was really very, showed that they were now a very sophisticated community. And I have to say, the hotel was comfortable. I had a fridge and a cooking stove in the room, air conditioning, and above all, Wi-Fi, and as I say, in the basement, these. And she told me, we looked at some Chinese machines, but we decided the American ones were much better. So these are actually from a firm in Massachusetts. So that's the end of the slideshow, and I'd just like to wrap up with a couple of general comments, and then perhaps we can open this up for conversation. There are a lot of stereotypes about Cretan men, and most of them are true. But what people don't usually understand is that this is not simply a performance for the sake of folklore or the sake of representing the community to the rest of the world, although that has become increasingly a part of it. These are communities that had to survive during the Ottoman period and beyond under very, very difficult conditions. During the German occupation of Crete, the old conditions became very present again. People were starving, they were very short of basic food and drink, except, of course, that shepherds were never completely short of food. There was always enough in the form of flock animals, but there was not much vegetation, and at times there was also not that much olive oil. There weren't that many olives available. So the communities in this area know poverty, they know starvation, they know hardship. Above all, they know how difficult it is to maintain a flock of any size, and these are not enormous flocks like you have in Australia. It's considered a very big flock if you have 1,000 sheep, really exceptionally large. It's very hard to maintain those flocks on that kind of terrain, especially in the absence of any kind of technological control or fencing. So what you see here is the survival of what I would call a social technology. The social technology is the stealing of sheep as a way of establishing connections among shepherds. Yes, it has economic consequences, not because you steal in order to sell the meat, but because by stealing you establish links with other shepherds and thereby protect your flocks. It makes perfectly good sense, and some version of this is to be found in pastoral communities, shepherding communities around the world. In recent years, the commercial side of it has started to prevail, and with it, of course, then come the connections with criminality. But I think it's very interesting that this community has reacted very forcefully, on the whole, against the actions of a small minority. They won't hand those people over to the authorities because going to the police is considered an act of betrayal. But the majority make it very clear to that small minority that it must never happen again. At the same time, they hope that the police will have learned the lesson. Now, I'm not so sure they have. The Greek police force has been very much weakened by the political games of the 80s and 90s, because at that time there were some wonderful police officers. I knew one who actually later took a degree, did some studies in anthropology, but he he was wonderful because he understood that you don't go into these villages with a whole patrol and attack the whole village. You're just asking for a counterattack. You show respect, and they will show you respect. So he would come on his own, go to the president, and they would arrest anyone who was under arrest. That would be it. Unfortunately, he lost his job. He was a very strong PASOK supporter. He lost his job because when Nea Dimokratia came to power, they kicked out all of the major officers. And he was actually a specialist in drug control, which is interesting. He's disappeared from sight. I didn't even know what's happened to him. When PASOK came back into power, they did exactly the same thing. So the two major political parties did serious damage. And I think this explains also why in the police force today, there is a disproportionately high number of supporters of Christiavier, of the Golden Dawn neo-fascist party, because the vacuum that was created by this kind of political game playing was actually very damaging to the future of the Greek police force. I'm not saying they're all Christiavites, of course not. There are many decent policemen still in the Greek police. But there's an incredible level of racism and ignorance, as I've experienced in talking to a number of police officers, male and female. And I believe that this is the result of the political failures that also contributed to the economic collapse in the early years of this century. And this, of course, has serious consequences for communities like Zonyana. Zonyana has a great deal of pride in its past. The old teacher, who's still very active, he's now about 84, is convinced that he has evidence that the dialect has elements even of the Minoan B, the dialect that was written in Minoan B. I don't know how convincing those arguments are to philologists, but his book apparently has been accepted for publication by the Academia Athinon, the Athens Academy, so there's some scholarly value to it. And the villagers on the whole would like to be able to continue living as they do, but with improved economic conditions, thanks to the development that was made possible in part as a reaction to the events of 2007. If the economic situation in Greece continues to improve, Zonyani men will be able to continue to be men in ways that their grandfathers couldn't have imagined. Eating salad, for example. And I know it sounds funny to put it that way, but these symbolic gestures have a great deal of meaning for people in these communities. If the economic situation deteriorates very much more, the temptation to turn to crime, where after all the connections exist, may prove too much for them. But these men are not at this moment criminals. They are people who bear a long-standing tradition that is not that of the Greek state and is not in many respects that of the Greek church, but has a symbiotic relationship with both. It is a community of people who are incredibly generous, as we found, very self-confident. The ethics committee at Harvard had one question for me. They said, if they like you so much, don't you think that there's a risk that they will feel that they have to answer all your questions even if they don't want to? I said, I have never yet met a Zonyana man who would do anything he didn't want to do. And that's a kind of pride that makes for deep friendship, because it also means people are self-confident. And the knowledge I have of this community is the result of being able to reach across enormous cultural differences, differences that probably are less great for me than they would be for somebody from a big city in Greece who came to them with all of these prejudices about, well, could you really spend the night there? I have spent many, many happy months in that community. I think I've lived there now for a total of maybe a year and 2/3, close to 2 years. I'm planning to go back again next year. I know that they trust me and I trust them. And while I may not like many of the rather misogynistic dimensions of their code of masculinity, I want to end with a few words about women in the community. Because the women in this community, the lecture was about masculinity, but the women in the community are also very strong, very proud, and perfectly able to tell their men when to get off. when to stop being silly. They tell stories that mock the men's tales of adventurous animal theft. They josh with their men in public. They are respectful, formally respectful when occasion requires, and they are certainly very careful not to allow any suspicion of sexual impropriety, for example. But the women play a very important part in this community, because when the shepherds go up into the hills in the summer for the summer pasture, they are, of course, close to the village. In the winter, they often go down to the coast, and then they're quite far away, and the village is run by the women. And this is very much like what my colleague Russ Bernard reported for the sponge fishers of Kalymnos. They go off for a season of sponge fishing, and the women run the community. So women have always had a very important role in this, and we should not conclude an analysis of masculinity without remembering that without those women, that masculinity would also not have been possible. But above all, I hope that I've convinced you with this lecture that most of what you read in the media about Zonyana is simply not true. That is, it is based on a misreading, it is based on a grievous misreading, on ignorance of social structure and social issues. And it is damaging because it then leads the prosecutors and the police to use the media as sources of information in ways that lead to further confrontation. I hope that in the near future, the authorities will take note of this and start to rethink their position. And I'd like to thank you all very much for your attention tonight. Thank you.
What a fascinating lecture. Thank you very much, Professor. Before we go to questions, and I'm sure that the Professor's more than happy to answer any of your questions, and I do state questions, please, not comments, if possible. Just a few housekeeping matters. First of all, I'd like to thank the Cretan Association of Melbourne that sponsored tonight's lecture. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if there's any representatives here at the moment, but thank you anyway. We're always welcome for people to sponsor any of our lectures. It's very important so these lectures continue to happen. Next week, we will have Dr. Alfred Vincent, who was a former lecturer at Melbourne at Sydney University, talking on El Greco, Man, Myth and Manner. And what's important is tonight's lecture was actually streamed live on the net. So that's fantastic, and we're hoping that that will continue. So that's what happens with new technology here. So we're very, very happy about that. And it's time to take questions. Please, whoever's interested in taking a question, asking a question, please put your hand up. And Evie, we'll start with a woman, a Cretan woman, actually.
As is appropriate.
You can come to the front if you want.
So if you could come up to the microphone.
No, it's okay. My question refers to the incident about the gentleman that had been in jail in the coffee shop and the shooting. In your recent experiences, the vendettas still go on, and wouldn't the other people shooting move on to a younger generation of the person if he wasn't a good enough victim?
Okay, so the vendetta is still very much, I hate to use the phrase alive and well, it's very much part of the tradition. Now, one of the things the villagers say is that, yes, it would continue into a future generation, and it is that knowledge that acts as a deterrent. So that, in fact, the incidence of lethal violence in these villages is much lower than it is, say, in Iraklio. And that is a statistically ascertainable fact. That you know that if you kill somebody, then your family is going to be at risk, because, and bystanders can also, including collateral members of the family, can also be hurt. So that's why the community then moves very quickly to try to introduce the sasmos. If it doesn't work, the sasmos can sometimes also involve trying to arrange a marriage between the two families. And that usually does work, because once you're sympathetic, of course, you're bound by a sacred tie, and that is very much respected. And that would only happen normally if, in fact, the vendetta had gone into another generation. But I do know of one case where a vendetta lasted for 4 generations. So it can happen.
4 generations, that's incredible. That's over 100 and...
Yeah, it's about 100 years, yeah, because, you know, you can get people who are of different generations, but actually the incidents are close together in time, yeah.
Any other questions? The gentleman.
Could you please tell us what's the population number of the village?
The village is now about 800 people. When I started working there, there were about 1,450. The decline in population is recent. In fact, after I did my early field work, it increased somewhat because one part of being a man is having a lot of sons. And also you need a lot of sons if you have a flock of sheep. So the population went up from 1,450 maybe to about 1,600. Then it started to drop. And the reason it dropped is that a lot of Zonyani colonized a number of places, including a large chunk of the suburb of Gazi in Iraklio. So actually, when the police descended on the village, they also descended on that piece of Gazi. And so if you count the number of people who regard themselves as Zonyani and live in Crete, it's probably several thousand now, because they spread out. A similar dynamic happened with Anoia, but Anoia kept its population a little bit more steadily because they also have more tourist activity. They have hotels and so on. Zonyana has this one hotel now, and there's a second one that's just been built. But I think it will never be a tourist attraction in the same way, and it doesn't have the political connections that Anoia has. So I predict that that population will continue to decline, but probably now very slowly. There is also the possibility, if the crisis bites any harder, that some of the Zonyani will return, because it's better to be poor but at least have something to eat in the village than starving in the town.
Any other questions? I note here that we have the Associate Professor Louise Hitchcock from Melbourne University. Welcome, Professor. It's great to see her. She's delivered some excellent lectures in the past to us. Any more questions?
Similar type of past in terms of ship stealing, vendettas, wife stealing and all that. And when those things started happening at Zonyana, I was talking with senior people within the society, and they were telling me, we need to make sure that Zonyana does not happen here. And they were keeping an eye on the young people to make sure that they don't go for drugs, stealing, going and taking ATMs and all of that. And they were very fearful that that might happen in Spakar because of the similarities with the area. Now, and from what I know, it hasn't happened. Now, do you know any other area within Crete that you had similar criminality like Zonyana, and why it happened? So if it didn't happen, why it happened in Zonyana and nowhere else?
Well, again, I want to emphasize that I don't want to talk about criminality in Zonyana except in a very small sense, that it was a relatively small number of people. The problem is that all of the villages there were in Milopodamos were growing hashish, and so were most of the villages in Sfakia at that time. Once Zonyana got hammered by the police, Zonyana became cleaner than any of the others. There's not a trace of it now, as far as I can tell. And they're pretty convinced that you wouldn't be able to find any there if you tried. I can't swear to it, but it seems, likely on the face of it. In Sfakia, the situation was very different. The social structure is actually not identical, but the most important thing is that Sfakia is heavily depopulated. There was not a big enough population to sustain the kind of communications network that would have created that situation. There were some people from Sfakia, apparently, who were involved in this one set of incidents, but I don't yet have the details of the origins of all of the actors. Certainly, it would have been rather pointless, I think, for young villagers in Sfakia, in those villages like Gaskifu and so on, to be involved in those activities because there just weren't enough people to sustain the connections. And I think that's really the crucial difference. Zonyana, Anoia, Livadia, Krana, those villages, and quite a few more villages in that area were robust in demographic terms. Coming back to your question, in fact, the population decline is very recent, and it was probably also accelerated a little bit by those incidents. But that decline had already happened in Sfakia. There are very few people living there, as you know. Those villages are tiny. And the majority of the new people living there are actually people who are descended from those villages and have now decided to go back. But it's still not a significant number. You need a fairly significant population to sustain criminality, just because you need people who collaborate with you to hide the evidence and so on. The old style of animal theft, I think it's not useful to describe as a criminal activity. I mean, that was a social custom that had, as I say, it had a very explicit purpose, which had to do with the maintenance of the flocks. But this clearly criminal activity that happened in Zonyana, I think has now been expunged. The problem is that Zonyana, I mean, these poor people now find that, well, I'll give you an example. I was in a taxi, and it turned, in Athens, it turned out the driver was of Cretan descent, and he suddenly told me a mandinada, which basically said, they accused us in Zonyana of growing hash. Well, it's not our fault. We planted kukia, we planted broad beans, and they came up as hash. You know, the name has become synonymous with all of these things, but in fact, if, in terms of the number of people involved in the criminal act, this is totally unfair. And I'm not just saying that because I love these guys, I love the village, and I have this relationship with them. It is simply an exaggeration that has taken hold because irresponsible journalists kept talking about Zonyana. There's another village nearby where a Greek colleague of mine, Anthropological, worked. When he started working there, the people were so angry already by what had happened in the media, they said, if you write anything like those, journalists will kill you. Now, nobody in Zonyana would ever have talked to me like that, even in the early days. So, I mean, Zonyana, and it actually had a reputation at the time for being gentler than the other villages in Upper Melopotamos. So the point I'm trying to make is not to whitewash the activities of those few people who did this, but to say what is disturbing is the way in which that activity came to characterize a whole community. And then, of course, it's understandable that the people in Sfakia would worry because, again, where did they get their information from? The media. And, you know, I think actually one little project I'd like to do in the not too distant future is an analysis of those media reports. There are a few responsible journalists. Now, here's an interesting one. I was interviewed in 2012, and I hadn't been to the village between 2007 and 2012, by Yorios Sakinis, a very well-known Cretan journalist who works for Cretan TV. And that interview, I had no idea this was going on. Back in the village, apparently, they all had the television sets blaring and tables out in the street, and they were watching the interview. But that was what persuaded the ringleader of the gang to talk to me, because he said, you at least understood, well, 60%, he said. I said, only 60%? He said, well, the journalists were less than 5, and I might give you 65. Obviously, I didn't know exactly what had happened, but his point was that in a very major way, the police were themselves responsible, not just for what happened, but also for spreading the bad name of the village. So I do feel a certain moral obligation to defend the village, while agreeing that those miscreants were engaged indeed in criminal activities. I really don't think that Sfakia was ever in much danger because there just weren't enough people to sustain it.
Well, there was another aspect for Sfakia. There's been a tremendous change from the focus of once upon a time agricultural and raising sheep. There's quite a few people that say, once upon a time we were looking after sheep, now we're looking after tourists.
Well, and that has not happened so much in Melopotamos. And it precisely the tourism that has allowed some of Sfakiani to come back, because most of those villages were almost completely deserted. Ayerumeli, Aschifu, they were all, really empty. The tourism provided some income, and I believe not all of the people who are profiting are actually locals. They're people from elsewhere who've come there because it's a romantic place with a romantic history, and it's very easy to make money. So the chances of criminality would be more, I think, people running hotels, for example, who might be ripping off the tourists, something like that. That's quite possible. But in Anoia, you have hotels, but that's partly because Anoia is very well connected politically, and they got a lot of money for restoration after the war because of the damage that was done. The Zonyani are very bitter about this. They say Anoia got burned because some of the Anoiani were traitors and betrayed them to the Germans, who then burned the village. We didn't have anyone who did that. We suffered a great deal, but at least we didn't do that, and we got no compensation after the war for our sufferings. So, you know, there are complex histories behind where tourism takes on and where it doesn't. And I mean, I'm sure that the owners of the 2 hotels and now 2 restaurants hope that some tourists going through Zonyana will stop. But, you know, they need to have people who could speak English or German and so on. And there just isn't the infrastructure.
Any other questions? Yes?
Your language skills are very good. How long did it take you to learn Greek?
I was 16 when I started. I did classical Greek at high school in England, and I never had a teacher in Greek, but I had a very good teacher in the form of kalokrasi, right, of wine, and of course in village in the form of tikuya. And I think then I went actually in the year after I graduated from, well, first of all, at Cambridge, where I was an undergraduate, I had many Greek friends. Several of them were Cypriot, so I ended my time and I hated what I was doing at Cambridge. I was a terrible student, I have to confess. So I ended up with a very unsatisfactory degree that led my advisor to tell me I had no future. But what saved me was the fact that I have the Greek that I speak now. Basically, I think most people can't tell I'm not Greek. During those years, I met a linguist who specialized in Cretan dialect. He was a British guy, and he taught me the first bits of Cretan I knew. And then I think in the village, I mean, they would actually give me little tests on this. They sometimes still do. When I arrive, they say, what does such and such mean? Or, you know, how would you say so and so? I usually take the bull by the horns now when I get to the village and immediately start speaking in dialect because they love it. And they immediately say, oh, you haven't forgotten us. Because for them, the language is, and even, I have to say, there are young people now who speak a more generalized Cretan dialect that's based on the Iraklio dialect rather than on that mountain speech. And so, for example, in the old days, they would say, "Skuto lavarichnos," which means I strike you on the forehead. It's a toast, right? And the answer is "Choguantistenomesu." Now, they'll often say, "Skuto lavariskosu," "Choguantistekomesu," which is more like standard Greek. And I would say to them, your father didn't talk that way. And he'd look at me. And then I'd tell them my version, and they'd say, yeah, you're right. So, you know, it's actually a little sad that you see this old dialect disappearing. But they're proud of the fact, I mean, they often, when people come from outside, they'll say, you see, he speaks our language. You Athenians, don't understand anything. And they're usually talking to Zonyani, who grew up in Athens. Every anthropologist has to do this, right? So when I started working in Thailand, I was 50 years old when I actually started learning Thai, and I had to learn Thai. I mean, that's just what you do. It's an instrument. But at the same time, I will say I have a special affection for Cretan dialect, particularly because my wife tends to speak Greek with a strong Cretan accent, and you might even be able to get if you can get a glass of wine to see what happens. But in general, I'd say that Greeks love to tell you Greek is such a difficult language. And I often would hear people say, τα ελληνικά είναι τόσο δύσκολα. Δεν υπάρχει ξένος που τα μαθαίνει καλά. And I would say, και εγώ τι είμαι?
I think we've got to start an advertising campaign and pictures out, someone promoting Greek and the learning of Greek for sure. Excellent, excellent, Professor. Now, we can't finish off this question and answer time without getting a question from John Rarakis, who is from Crete, από την Επισκοπή. Όχι όμως στα κριτικά, σε παρακαλώ, Γιάννη, έτσι. Όχι στα κριτικά, γιατί θα μπερδευτούμε. Do you need the mic, John? You're a man's man. Come on, you're a Cretan. You've got a big, strong voice, haven't you?
I was only there last week with these people,
be nice to me. They say, hey, Hexford Mustache.
Well, on...
Or rather, logo su mustache, ci appatti mustache. And Sado let us to
Professor Louise Hitchcock, please.
I would just like to say, I have more than a comment than a question, but I worked several seasons on a Greek excavation.
We'll let you have a comment. That's not a problem. An exception.
I worked several seasons on a Cretan excavation in East Crete, Greek excavation, and even though my Greek is really pathetic, I always use the Cretan accent, and the other Greeks said to me that they were all from Athens, of course, why don't you speak proper Greek? And I said, because it makes the workers happy, and if you can make somebody happy so easily, why don't you?
Well, there is a great deal of pride. And, you know, we anthropologists say that the difference between a language and a dialect is that a dialect is a language that doesn't have an army or a navy. So it's a question, it's a political difference. It is actually not a morphological difference, not a linguistic difference at all. And in Zonyana, they will often say to people when they're asked who I am, they say, and he speaks our language, militi glossamas, because for them it's a mark of inclusion, it's a mark of intimacy, familiarity. So I think you did exactly the right thing. In fact, if you and my wife have a conversation, the rest of us can sort of listen in and probably hear these, you know, chut going on through the conversation. But it is, of course, more than just an accent. And if I may tell the story of the taxi, we were traveling back from Crete, got in a cab in the airport, and this was last year, and the taxi driver said, so, you know, where are you coming from? We said, from Crete. And he said, oh, is it very hot in Crete? And my wife replied, cesto ori. E questo vuno. The taxi driver didn't get it at all, of course. So I said, shh, you're speaking Kritika. But, I mean, there is something intimate and wonderfully warming about being able to communicate with people in that language. And, of course, as I wanted to know about animal theft, there was no way they would have talked to me except in dialect. And especially those very subtle shifts from Standard Greek into dialect and back, which were markers of the level of intimacy that I had at various points in the encounter. So, I mean, for an archaeologist, it's important, I think, to speak the local form of the language just because you want them to like you, as you say. For me, it was that, and it was also a professional necessity in the sense that I really did need to make them feel comfortable. And I wanted to know whether they were telling me what they would say to each other, and that meant I would also have to be able to listen in on their conversations. I was not eavesdropping, I was there publicly, but again, you know, they might have thought when they spoke Kritika that I wouldn't have understood, but in any case, they soon began to realize that, yeah, I was one of them. And I'm very proud to say they now call me Anazonianos. So.
On that note, Michael, if you're here tomorrow night, please join us here at the mezzanine level. We're having a fantastic music night tomorrow, and we welcome your company. And if those of you haven't booked tickets, please do so. Thank you very much for what is an excellent lecture, and as a gesture of our appreciation, a bottle of not Cretan wine, it's local wine here. We promote Australian product. Wonderful. And a few of the publications that we produce as a community. Once again, put your hands together for what was an excellent lecture. Thank you very much, Michael. And I'm sure the professor is more than happy to stay around and have a chat with you guys after the lecture. Thank you very much again, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.